I really feel like I'm in the spotlight. No, so thank you everyone and good evening. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. The book came out about a couple of months ago, and I've been doing some events in Delhi and Bombay, and to be honest, it all felt I had started off in the wrong cities. Now I can't see any of you. So I was waiting actually to come to Bangalore because obviously the book is about technology and its implications, and there's no better place, I think, to have some of the discussions that I'm hoping to spark with the book than Bangalore. And I think within Bangalore also, I think there's no better place to have these discussions than BIC. So I'm really glad and delighted to be here. What I thought I'll do in the next 15-20 minutes or so is give you a brief outline of what I've covered in the book, the themes I've covered in the book, and some of the recommendations I have in the book as well, and then leave you with some thoughts, some questions that hopefully then with Mr. Pai, Irina, and Prashant we can get deeper into. Let me first start with why I wrote the book in the first place, actually. I think as Ravi mentioned, the book is at the intersection of technology, geopolitics, economic competitiveness of nations, and the impact of tech on society. The reason I even thought about writing the book actually goes back to the mid of 2020, when actually, if some of you will recall, there were border clashes between India and China in Ladakh. And while that was going on, and I'm based in Delhi mostly, the conversation in the foreign policy circles and the security circles in Delhi was very much focused on the actual military battle or the military clash going on the border. And being in the tech world myself and straddling these two worlds between tech and geopolitics, I was also watching many of the developments that were going on in the tech world. Right? India was trying to ban Chinese apps. The US and China were engaged in massive tech and trade wars. And to me, a lot of these things seem to be connected, right? But most people in Delhi, at least, were not making some of those connections, right? And that was really one of the first sparks for me to write some of the things I've mentioned in the book, right? So one of the key goals of the gaps I was trying to fill with the book was to connect some of the pieces that I thought should be connected for everyone and build up that big picture of how tech was shaping our world, right? Our world order, our economic competitiveness, our relations with other nations, and so on and so forth. The other reason I wanted to write this book actually was the fact that, if you are like me in the world of tech, or if you're in the world of policy or outside, most of the narrative that's currently being built out there about some of these themes is actually coming largely from the US perspective, or sometimes the European. I found that what was missing was a truly deeply Indian perspective. And maybe I'd go as so far to say an Asian perspective on how tech was shaping our world, right? So that was the other second reason I would say, besides the big picture perspective, I also wanted to put out a perspective that was more grounds up from an Indian standpoint. The third perspective I thought was, I come from a fairly multidisciplinary background. I spent the last decade or so in the tech world, but prior to that, I've worked in think tanks like the Carnegie Endowment in Washington. I've worked with McKinsey in New York, and so on and so forth. And so I come from a fairly multidisciplinary background, at least in my head. And I thought that it was very important to bring a multidisciplinary perspective to these issues as well, and not to consider them only from, let's say, a tech venture capital, tech startup perspective, or just from a policy standpoint, but really to bring together perspectives from history, philosophy, economics, politics, obviously, foreign policy, and sociology and psychology a bit together to provide a more holistic, multidisciplinary framework to how we can think about some of these issues, or at least a broad framework to think about these issues, no matter whether you're in the tech world or not. The final reason I would say why I wrote the book was that most of the literature out there that at least I was seeing was about how tech was shaping our worlds or how we needed to adapt to this juggernaut of technology, most of this literature seemed to be written from a company or a corporate standpoint, right? So you'll find a lot of books out there that are talking about digital transformation strategies, how companies can get disrupted, how the Kodaks of the world got disrupted. So it's very much from a corporate standpoint, right? And even many of my own professors from business school, etc., have largely written from that standpoint. But what I thought was missing was that because of this juggernaut of technology shaping the world order and almost the economic destinies of all nations in the world, I thought it's very important to write something from a nation standpoint as well, right? So these were some of the reasons that really led me to writing this book. And I thought I'd share this first to give you that kind of context for what I've tried to embark on, so that even when you're reading the book, you can maybe assess me on those criteria, whether I've managed to succeed in some of those endeavors or not. And I'm sure, given Mr. Pai and Irina have both read the book, they'll be critical enough to give me a sense of whether we've achieved some of those objectives. With that said, let me give you the broad framework of what I call the great tech game. Right? As I was mentioning, one of the key things that I look for whenever I'm trying to understand something new or something unfamiliar is to try and place it in a slightly longer term historical context. And that's really when I started writing this book, one of my first exercises was to be able to do that for myself and for folks who were going to read the book, right? So the first section of the book is what I call the historical section, where I talk about the great games in the past. So when I look at history, in my mind, the way I see it, there have been some great games in the past which have shaped our world and our history as humanity. Right? So the 4 or 5 that I mentioned in the book in the first 3 or 4 chapters are what I call the great agri and trading game, followed by the great industrialization and colonization games, followed by the great capitalism game, which then culminates into today's era, which I call the great tech game. And I've provided that historical sort of frame to help you understand and help myself actually explain this to people, that the era that we're living in and the kind of transformative impact that tech is having on the world today is as big, if not bigger, than the impact that agriculture had on our society, our economies, our countries, our regions, various regions and civilizations of the world. Similarly, industrialization and colonization, how these great games shaped who the new winners and new losers would be in the world, and how even the capitalism game, for example, has largely shaped who have been some of the economic winners and losers in the last 100 years or so. All of that context to say that today we are living in the great tech game. And to me, each of these great games that I've very briefly alluded to, but which I delve quite deeply in the book, each of these great games have 3 or 4 key characteristics that I'll share with you. One, they tend to shape the economic destiny of regions or nations or empires, whatever were the existing political units of that time. They tend to shape the relationships between these regions, right? The world order in a way, the hierarchy of nations almost, if you were to think of it from an economic hierarchy standpoint. They also, each of these games have successively built on the games that have come before them, right? So the winners in the great industrialization colonization game actually mastered trade and agri, in fact, and agriculture as well. Right? The colonial masters of our world back then actually mastered the art of building agricultural surplus and building trade networks globally before they became colonial powers, and then that helped them also become the major industrial powers of the time. The major industrial powers then had a leg up when it came to the great capitalism game, as I think of it. The US, for example, which was clearly one of the winners of the great capitalism game, was also one of the winners at the industrial game, even though they were industrial winners maybe a little bit later than Great Britain, but they were masters of the great industrialization game as well. Right? So each of these games builds on the previous one, is not so disconnected with the previous one, creates new winners, new losers, and tends to shape the economic destiny of nations, the geopolitics of our world, as well as has a massive impact on society, on culture, and our values. right? If you look back at the industrial era, I'm sure all of you are familiar how much that has shaped the values of our times. From just the fact that our families have gone from much bigger, larger families to more nuclear families, we've become concentrated in, urban jungles, right? And so on and so forth, right? The values and what society cares for, cares about, also gets shaped by these great games. So all of that framed to provide you a lead up to what I call the great tech game. That, in my view, my main argument in the book is that today we're living in what I call the great tech game. And the great tech game is now shaping all of these three pieces that I just mentioned: the economic, the geopolitical, as well as the societal. And so in my book, the subsequent chapters after the history section delve into these three. I talk about the economic destiny of nations, how tech is shaping that. Today, countries that are growing their digital economies fast are seeing their productivity levels grow up. Countries that are focusing on building technology as a factor of production are growing faster, are seeing higher productivity growth as well. They're also the ones that are building the largest tech conglomerates or largest tech startup ecosystems. So technology has become as important a factor of production. For those of you who might have studied economics in undergrad, know that we are told land, labor, capital as the key factors of production. But I argue that today, really, accumulation of technology, much like accumulation of capital, was important and is important. Today, accumulation and building of technology as a factor of production, no matter what business you're in. You don't have to be in the tech sector. You don't have to be at a Microsoft or an Infosys to say tech matters in my business. Today, no matter what business you're in, you have to accumulate, much like you accumulate talent or labor, you have to accumulate capital to grow your business. You have to accumulate technology. And that's true now of farmers, small businesses, schools, universities. You name any business in any sector, technology is a key factor of production. The other piece I mentioned in the economic section from a nation standpoint is you've got to start thinking about not just your GDP, but your digital GDP or your tech-driven GDP. Right? There's this concept of the digital economy, which we hear being thrown about. I go into fairly deep discussion on that concept itself, that if I was to even ask all of you what our GDP in India is, some of you will know what our GDP is, but I can bet that most of you actually don't know what our digital economy's size, growth rates, etc. is. So, much like John Doerr, a venture capitalist, says, if you're not measuring what matters, you probably cannot grow that. You probably don't know what you have to do. Similarly, I say in the digital economy era, we must be measuring the digital economy very systematically, very scientifically, and breaking it down into its constituent elements to see which pieces of that broader digital economy are growing in India, for example, what are not growing, what subsectors are not, and so on and so forth. So that much like we analyze our traditional economy metrics, we must be measuring these specific metrics as well. The other important piece that I mentioned in the economic section is the fact that we must not measure our success in our digital economy by just single metrics or some vanity metrics like the number of unicorns. While it's a very important and big celebration of our startup ecosystem that we now have over 100 unicorns or so, I think that that's possibly just a vanity metric. And what we must be measuring is a much more comprehensive set of metrics that track, for example, our digital infrastructure growth, our digital services growth, our digital trade growth. And also, if you look at just our unicorns, one of the key things I like to highlight is that if you look at some of the big tech firms of the US or even China for that matter, the balance sheet, the wealth on their balance sheets of even one of those big tech firms will probably be greater than the wealth or the balance sitting on the balance sheets of our 100 unicorns. And so while we pat ourselves on the back of our growth of our startup ecosystem, we've got to be looking forward to the next step, which is to make sure that we build companies that are inherently profitable, have moats around them, and can actually truly lead to wealth creation. Of course, then the question also arises whether the wealth creation driven by unicorns or big tech firms, whether that's actually translating into the wealth of nations as a whole or not. And that's a question I think we might actually delve into the discussion. So that gives you a little bit of the color on the economic section. I then move on to the geopolitical impact of tech. For those who are interested in the intersection of tech and geopolitics, and I know some of you are, I've been talking to folks, I think, at the Takshila Institution also in Bangalore about this. The intersection of tech and geopolitics is, I think, an absolutely fascinating space. And that's, in fact, one of the key, as I mentioned earlier, one of the key reasons why I even thought about writing this book. Tech today is shaping the world order, clearly. Tech is shaping geopolitics. The question is how, right? So in the geopolitical section, I provide some examples of how tech is starting to shape geopolitics, foreign policy, and the world order, right? I'll give you an example today. Um, in the past, friendships and alliances between nations used to be driven by things like your geographical location, your historical, cultural affinity with each other, and things like that. Today, however, if you look at some of the recent friendships, recent alliances, recent enmities, or recent rivalries in our world order, they're largely being driven by technological competition or technological capability. I think all of us are familiar that the US and China are today engaged in a strategic battle, in a strategic competition, economically, also on the tech side. But that doesn't mean that that competition is only limited to those two. I believe that this game is inherently global this time around, unlike maybe, let's say, the colonial era where there were only a few nations really competing for leadership. Today, the game is global. Today, many of our friendships, even if you look at India, today, India and Australia are getting close. India, Australia, Japan, and the US are now part of what we call the Quad. And one of the key elements or key pillars of the Quad relationships is actually technological cooperation. Australia, for example, is otherwise, was maybe 10 years ago only a cricket rival for us in India, but today it's a key strategic partner. And why is that? For India, Australia, amongst other things, is also one of the largest holders of rare earth materials, which are critical elements of the semiconductor supply chain. We're sitting in Bangalore. I don't have to emphasize how important semiconductors are in the tech-driven economy already, but also increasingly more important over the coming decades. And so Australia, being the second largest holder of reserves after China, obviously becomes a key critical partner today. So that's just one example of how today friendships, alliances, partnerships in the world order are being driven by what you have to offer in the tech arena. Israel, with its cybersecurity expertise, often becomes a partner for many countries. India today has many key elements, I would argue, that make it a very attractive partner in the international relations space. India Stack, which I think we'll get to in our discussion as well, is a key element, key pillar for that. Of course, our IT services firms for the last several decades have been something we've exported and something we've helped many countries around the world embark on their digital transformation exercises through. Right? Increasingly, our startup ecosystem is expanding outside of India. Of course, India is a large digital market, so we are an attractive partner because of that as well. So various reasons why today India in the world order is an attractive partner. And many of these reasons are new, were not necessarily there, let's say, 30, 40 years ago. The other piece in the geopolitical section that I talk about, which might be of interest to some of you, is the fact that the future of war is changing as well. The future of war is now what many in the military circles call hybrid, right? And there are hybrid doctrines now coming up in military circles where wars are no longer just about physical battles, even though the Russia-Ukraine crisis led many to say that, oh, we've returned to World War II type battles. But in reality, if you look at how that Russia-Ukraine crisis also played out, even though Russia this time around, even though it's a major cyber power, chose not to use its cyber capabilities up front, but for the last several years has been actually leveraging its cyber strength to achieve some of its geopolitical objectives. If you look at the response of the West to the Russian attacks, you'll find that tech was a key element there. Many of the large big tech firms out of the US were key partners for Ukraine in defending both their physical borders, but more importantly, their digital infrastructure, their internet infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And their cyber defenses were driven through partnerships with many big tech firms based out of the US. And if you look now in the context of India, one of the key things I argue for India as well is that while we emphasize growing our naval strength, our army, our air force, we have to have a much bigger emphasis on growing our cyber offense and cyber defense capabilities. Because the future of war is hybrid, the next war with any neighbor of ours or non-neighbor might not be driven by the army or the navy or the air force, but might actually be driven by a cyber command or by a cyber army, right? So many countries around the world have now formal cyber commands, including the US, including Chinese. There's an integrated sense of integrated forces that integrates all your 3 or 4 existing commands with some of these emerging commands like the cyber one, the space one, etc. So we've got to also in India move much faster, much more quickly on that front. And of course, public-private partnerships in the cyberspace are going to be a key part of what I call India's game plan, even in this domain. Finally, I'll touch upon the last section of the book where I talk about the impact on society. To be honest, before I started writing the book, my focus had always been on the economic and the geopolitical, but that was largely because of my own background. But as I started studying some of these issues historically, also in the historical context, I realized actually the biggest way in how these great games of the past have shaped our world has actually been on the cultural side, on the value side, on the societal side. And I think similarly, it's very important for us to be having a lot more conversation about how some of these developments in the tech world are shaping our society, our culture, our values, our behaviors, our relationships. We, of course, talk a lot about distraction and the attention deficit because of smartphones, but that's not just it. I think there's a much bigger impact that tech is having on our world, on our society, on our values, much like the industrial era did. Today, we are seeing our society, our families, for those who have kids, I have young kids, I see that the relationship in the family is again changing in many ways because of tech. There's, of course, the fact that today our leaders are much more, and there are many examples around the world where leaders are a lot more impatient. One of the reasons psychologists and sociologists have argued is because of this tech-driven era, or what people call the Twitter mindset. Diplomacy has always been a game of patience, a game of deep consideration. But if we live in a world that is so quick to tweet or so quick to take decisions, basis the first set of things that you're seeing, the question is, in 30, 40 years, are we going to be living in a more diplomatic world? Are we going to be living in a world that relies more on diplomacy, or is quick to actually, fall into battles and wars of any kind? Right? I give an example in the book. The leaders of pre-independence India, Mahatma Gandhis of the world, used to be reading long treatises like War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. The question is that what our leaders today or our leaders in 30, 40 years are going to be doing, or are they going to be relying on much quicker, faster, impulsive decision making? Right? So these are some of the questions that I think we as a society have to think about as well on the value side. And the piece that I end with, the conclusion that I end with in all of this, to be honest, is that we must realize that tech is clearly shaping our world in many ways. There are tech pessimists who believe that tech is shaping our world in many negative ways. I am what I call a tech realist. I believe that, yes, it is shaping us in many ways, both positive and negative, but it's really up to us to make sure that this doesn't become a one-way street, that tech continues to just shape us and we lose our agency here as humans or as a society. We've got to make sure that this is a two-way street, and that tech, as much as it shapes us, must also be shaped by us proactively. Our values must come first, and we must have a values-first approach to designing technology, to designing tech products, to using technology, and to regulating technology. I think that values-first approach is going to be very important as a shift in our thinking if we want to make sure that tech doesn't just shape us in adverse ways. I think with that, we can maybe then launch into the discussion. So first of all, let me thank all three panelists who very kindly agreed to take time and come here. Uh, Mr. Pai, Irina, and Prashant. Um, I'm not going to delve too much into all three of their bios. I'm sure you're familiar with them. Prashant has been one of the early venture capitalists in the Indian VC industry. I have a quick memory I'll share, which Prashant will not remember, I'm sure. When I was still in business school in the US, and I was just starting to set up the fund that I did eventually. One of the first people I met in California was actually Prashant at Excel's office back in the day. So that was almost now 10, 12 years ago. Irina is obviously at Microsoft, and Mr. Pai, I'm sure, is also all too, familiar to all of you in Bangalore, especially, but even otherwise. So what I thought I'll do is I'll first maybe go around and ask all three of you to maybe take just a few minutes each and give me your thoughts, your reactions to any parts of the book that maybe sprung out to you, any pieces that you thought I was wrong on, or any pieces that you thought I missed in thinking about some of these issues. And please be critical, as critical as you can be on that front. So maybe we'll start with that. Any reactions to the broader themes that I've raised? And then I have some questions that I'll then address individually to all of you as well. Sure. So maybe we'll start with you, Mr. Pai.
Thank you. I like the book because it is a very broad writing on a very major issue that is changing our world. We know that the Industrial Revolution changed the world forever, created Europe to dominate the world, socially, economically, in all areas. And now we're getting the digital revolution. We are in the digital era, which is going to change the world. We don't know what kind of world we're going to end up with, but you certainly see the huge change. Now, there are three issues that I think we should possibly look at in the next edition and maybe when you write them again. And I think these are important issues. You have gone through that, but I think you should possibly look at it deeply. One is the issue of individual rights to group rights. Now, in the last 100 years, we've seen the rise of democracies. We didn't see the rise of democracies so much before the Second World War. So we've seen the rise of democracies, independent nations, and the importance of individual rights, the Global Declaration on Human Rights in 1948, Universal Declaration, which made sure that all our rights as citizens of this planet were protected. Now, we need a Universal Declaration of Digital Rights because the battle is between individuals and states and corporates. And the reason is very clear, as you have pointed in parts of your book, that all our data, all our likes, dislikes, what we think, how we think, has been captured by somebody and kept in a database, and that can be manipulated and messages sent to us to change the way we think, because this is a battle for our minds. And it's happening very sublimely and in a manner which we don't understand. You can see it in Sri Lanka. I mean, they came with a campaign on Facebook to get everybody to come on one particular day, and the government hardly knew what was happening. And suddenly they were inside the presidential palace, and there's a revolution. They don't know what to do now, kicking out the president. They're still in bad shape. But look at the impact of what happened. And how could they gather that? How could they do that? But it also brings to the bear how they can be manipulated. Now, suppose you had somebody like the great capitalist sitting down in Europe who is pushing money, like the color revolutions or whatever it has happened in Eastern Europe, manipulating this, what happens? So why should we have a universal declaration of human rights? So all of us ordinary citizens get our rights protected, and is defined as to what our rights are. Because right now, we hardly have any rights in the digital era. We all become widgets. And when robots and humanoids come, we're going to be hurt even more, right? That is one. The second big issue is the rise of global corporates with huge economic power and data versus the nation state and individuals. This triangle has never been one-sided as today. Yes, the East India Company dominated India. We know that. But still, the British were able to legislate. But today, we have such huge economic power, $1 trillion valuation, $500 billion revenues, $100 billion of annual profit, $400 billion, $300 billion of cash. And the economic power they have, and the power of the data that they have, and how they control. And some of these companies run by juveniles who just don't understand the responsibility they should have. And then you have this idiotic governments like in the US, where when you go before Congress, they're asking silly questions to Zuckerberg. You saw that, right? I mean, it's astonishing that they never had any thoughts. And these control, for example, Irina's company controls the global business. You can't run without Microsoft. They control it. Yeah. I mean, Apple controls 2 billion devices. iOS system, you're in the system, are you shut out? And now EU is coming. Then Facebook has about maybe 3.5, 4 billion, right? And Instagram, where, people are doing whatever they're doing there. And how is it controlling the mind? The money that they have, what countries are going to control them, and politicians are getting into it because they're threatened by being shut out of the system, as President Trump out. And we poor individuals, where did this power triangle lie? And the third is the last point of your talk about global conflicts. How do we handle the issues of a global conflict where AI and machine learning and humanoids and robots are going to come? What ethical standards do we have to define when robots fight battles against humans? Can you trigger a robot to kill people? Can you have a RoboCop who shoots people? No. Can the robo be autonomous? Who controls it? Who does what? Because today human beings control human beings. Yes, they go kill people in war. In the police come, they can shoot you. They can do what you want. But there is some application of mind, except in war, where there is one-sided view. But how does it work when they are controlled by somebody, and can they be captured by somebody else? And this war or this fight, how do we prevent it? Now, you had this treaty between the United States and the USSR on interballistic missiles, right? To stop the nuclear war, right? Now, the nuclear war can still happen, but now the digital war can be much greater, because you can bring down the world in maybe 24 hours, fighting with the cyber armies. And that asymmetry of power, that means there are 4 or 5 blocks, EU, United States, India, and China, which can possibly participate, with the US being the strongest, China being number 2, EU 3, and India 4 because of lack of resources. But we certainly shall come up. And in this era, what kind of conflicts can come? What are the big issues? And how do we use space for conflict? Now, these are issues which are not debated, and they're all based on this great tech game. I think these are the 3 big issues I would suggest to you when you write your second version or whatever it is, because you address them. I mean, the economic impact is addressed, and the social impact is addressed in terms of individual behavior. How children are born with an iPad. I mean, whatever they use now, right? I mean, they navigate. Yesterday, I saw some monkeys navigating on Twitter, and they were doing the same thing we are doing. I don't know what they're doing, but anyway, I don't know what's going to trigger inside that. So I think these are some issues which I think need to be debated too, using your book as a background and the great games that you play.
Great. No, thank you so much, Mr. Pai. One of the things that I do agree have to be very much a focus of both policymakers, us as citizens, and of course, even the corporates, to that matter, is to make sure that this triangle of the corporate, the government, and the individual or the citizens, there has to be a balance maintained between these 3. If any one or even any 2 of these become allied or too powerful, the third can really suffer, right? With that, let me actually go to Irina. Irina, obviously, you are also one part of that triangle, but also the second as an individual. But first, maybe just your reactions to the book, any pieces that jumped out, etc.
Thanks. First of all, I think a great way that you've kind of brought the confluence of what's happening in the world of tech, what's happening in society, and how tech can be an enabler for making an impact on societal impact change, and the larger geopolitical way things are getting played out. Because at the end of the day, I mean, tech has been something in the context of India, in the world, making lots and lots of strides. But I think about India itself, the way we are kind of using tech for India to be in the global map for so many things, including, say, us becoming a $200 billion Indian tech industry, growing at 15%. The number of digital transactions which are happening, we being the largest country for any UPI payments. And the internet users, say, what increased from 2017 to 2021, being now 67% to being 4% in 2007. So the strides are massive. So the time in my mind for what we do for the country because of the opportunities, and it frankly just blew up because of the pandemic, because we had to embrace tech. We were not like any other country, right? So the industries, people, economy, last mile, in my mind, is making a lot of difference. The other part that you touched upon in your book is about geopolitical things in the context of war, seen and unseen. In that context, actually, in Russia, before 23rd February, the war had started a day earlier when the cybercrime was unleashed. And that was that Fox Blade, which was there. And we know it because, I mean, from a Microsoft standpoint, we were working very closely with the government to ensure that how it can be mitigated and arrested. So while there'll be a proliferation of bad players, the way the government and all the corporates are coming across with various industry bodies to put much more intelligence and defense at the perimeter of what software can do and can't do is also an art which is growing. The last part is I really liked about the way you called yourself as a tech realist. Now that somewhere got me thinking because um, it's a good way of kind of having a measured progress in what we are doing. Tech, for its own ability, can go at a speed by not being responsible. How are you ensuring that tech, whatever it does, the ownership lies with the person, the individual, the corporate, which is kind of putting that in the hands of the users? I, for one, am a tech optimist. But having said that, I like it when people kind of put that caution of, have you done all the checks and balances and the boxes when you put things out? There isn't a bias which is kind of coming across in the hand. There isn't a way of thinking that it doesn't impact a societal good. So that's a good segue that you've put across, and a thin line of seeing as to how we measure the progress.
Thank you so much, Irina. Um, yes, sure, please. Round of applause, of course. I think one of the key things that I'll maybe delve into even more is the role that large tech firms are now starting to play. One of the interesting tables I've put together in the book is the fact that there's now I've put a table together for folks to see the rise of new geopolitical actors in our world. Right, there was a time when the geopolitical actors in our world were largely nations. Then, of course, there have been non-nation state actors. Right, we are in India very familiar with terrorism, terrorist groups, etc. Right, so those are some examples of non-state groups that became geopolitical actors in the last few decades. But really, as tech and geopolitics intersects, and the example of Russia and Ukraine that you've given, there are many other such examples of attacks and defense mechanisms being derived from this cooperation between big tech firms and governments and even armies. I think that's a very interesting piece that you have these whole new set of geopolitical actors. Who would have thought that Microsoft would be one of the main geopolitical actors in the Russia-Ukraine crisis?
No, I think the big issue is the ability of one country where all these companies are headquartered to get access to global data and manipulate that company
Correct.
to do what they want.
That's right.
So I like what Irina said, how we control. But which country is getting protected? United States, where everybody is headquartered there. They're subject to their laws, to the NSA, to subpoena. What happened to the rest of us? We're all doomed. Europe is doomed. India is doomed. China has got its own firewall. Now, to me, that is the big issue. Who control these big tech companies in conflicts?
Let me differ.
This is a
Let
very
me
big
differ
issue.
from you on that one.
this is why I sat on this side,
Yeah,
so that
yeah.
you guys can
I do have a
debate
point of
this.
view on that. See, while they might be located at any part of the world, think about GDPR. That originated in Europe for its own citizens to say that how does data privacy for citizens like you and I get protected when it goes to any firm? Forget any tech firm. It can be hospitality, private sectors, airlines, anywhere. How do I ensure that data I give for any usage is specific for only that usage and not for anything else? The second thing I do want to also call out is that technology, which has data as the one way of doing things, has a lot of layers built on it in terms of anonymizing the data. That's the way it's going. So, frankly, there's billions in stake when you kind of use it for any other purpose which can go in for litigation. So I would say there are lots of checks and balances, Mr. Pai. So
No,
maybe
so I want to come back to this
I'll
point, but let
just
me
make a comment on that. See, I think in AI, I think a lot of it's just not the raw data. It's the features that get derived from that data, right? And a lot of value for that
Yeah.
is something that countries will want to in some way own, right? And the experts of the previous era are now the people who can derive these features from this data, right? And if we don't have any access to that data in our country, or have no way of collecting and harnessing that data, we will not control the features, and the intelligence are in these features, right? So to some extent, I would agree with Pai on this, that we need to have, if the data is being harnessed from and the insights are being harnessed from our citizens here, then it can't all be future features that give intelligence being harnessed in some other country.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
So there is a balance here that needs to be, anyway. So I
Correct.
think,
So Irina, I think you might have seen, Mr. Pai, you might have also seen that there's a chapter in my book about digital colonialism, which sometimes also gets referred to as data colonialism. Because in all of this, of course, the ownership of data, then the insights and the intelligence and the products and the features
right,
that you build bases that data,
Data,
and sometimes leveraging that data,
right.
that then becomes a virtuous cycle, because
Yeah.
the more products and features that you have, the more data you keep generating,
Correct.
and it's a virtuous cycle that you enter, that of course big tech firms now, whether it's the Microsofts of the world or the Amazons of the world or the Googles of the world, you name it, or the Flipkarts of that world for that matter, right? Or the Olas of the world for that matter, start to own. Now, of course, the ownership of that data, access to that data will become very important, right? And I think this battle that who should own that data has to have a more holistic framework for analysis, right? So one of the things I've tried to do in the book is to say that it's very easy in a country like India. And to my point earlier, when I said that I wanted to write this book from an Indian perspective also, because if we were having this discussion in the US, the discussion around data would be very different. But when we are having the discussion in Bangalore, this becomes a major point from our perspective, because there are many analogs to how the East India Company leveraged and extracted resources from India for its own benefit, where the benefits did not accrue largely to Indians. You can argue some benefits did, but the vast majority of the benefits, of course, did not accrue to Indians at that time. So there are clear parallels to that today. But I also do think that it's going to be intellectually very lazy for us to jump in and say that today's big tech firms are data colonialists or anywhere similar to the East India companies of the world, unless we figure out that, yes, there are these 5 things that they're doing that all seem extractive. So the question is, just because to now, Irina, I'll come to your defense for a second, just to play devil's advocate. Are we sure that these companies are not just big businesses? What is the difference between a big business? We've seen big oil companies, big telecom companies in India. We don't complain about Airtel, right? Having all our data. So why is it that we are complaining about Microsoft
Okay.
or Google or any of the other
part of
big
the
tech
book
firms?
which I didn't see, which is what really makes ecosystems work, right? So this aspect that we're just talking about, let me kind of give you another example that today almost 1 in 4 software engineer developer is going to be in this country, right? So that's an ecosystem that will give us just a very different leverage when it comes to not now building applications, but building infra. So what all go into building this kind of tech infra? I think data is a very important component of that infra. So if we don't have that data, you can have other components in the ecosystem, right? Like I said, if you can't build the software stack, if you don't have developers or companies where you have developers that have built scale applications. And today we have those in India. We have them being able to build applications which can work with. Thankfully, all our consumer apps deal with hundreds of millions of users. So and now they become design partners to build infra and developer tools which were previously only possible in the US.
That's right.
So this is just an amazing time that we'll see in the next decade, where the ecosystem that just was in one part of the world now gets shifted here. And I would argue that data and AI models and intelligence around that is going to be a very key component of that. And we need the developers who you can co-design these next generation infrastructure and developer tools with. Because if you see the top companies in NASDAQ, outside of your Apple and few other people, so it's the software, whether it's a Snowflakes or it's the companies that actually build this software infra stack who will control the next generation of technology. So it's really important that we make sure that every component of this we somehow make accessible to ensure that as an ecosystem we have that next generation power. That today we are even, I mean, if you take Freshdesk or we take any of these, we're just application builders, right?
That's right.
So
We're not too deep in that.
We're just not
software.
deep in that.
We're
stack.
definitely not in the
The
infra.
only
layer.
place we have gotten deep into the stack is the public goods infrastructure we have built with Aadhaar, and which we can talk about later. But that's an amazing other soft power we have developed. So we have the public stack, soft power.
Correct.
Now, can we build the enterprise infra stack, developer and infra stack? So then we kind of control, hopefully 10 years from today, the two major components, government, the whole, government platforms through Aadhaar,
That's
or
right.
the India stack, and, the next generation of, the companies like Postman, or, I mean, there's still, but there are a few others who are now starting to build security and other co-design them and co-create them with Indian CTOs and Indian architects, which is a whole new opportunity that will change, I think, a lot of our path.
So let me just expand a couple of the pieces that you've all mentioned and referred to, right? Which is now this data piece, and Prashant, to your point about the talent that India has today, that's a key strength. One of the things I've tried to do in the book is to say that I think throughout the book I've tried to make sure that we don't end up patting ourselves on the back too much. It's very important that every time we are evaluating the likelihood of India competing or succeeding in the great tech game, we should try have a more holistic framework of evaluating where we stand. So I have these 5 things that I'm going to put out there for all of your feedback. 5 things that I feel are the key elements of winning in the great tech game. 1, talent. 2, capital, access to capital. 3rd, technology. And when I say, I'll just explain it in a second. The 4th piece is policy. And the 5th piece is actually a strategy. Right? So let me just spend 30 seconds or maybe 10 seconds on each, actually. Talent, I think, Prashant, as you've spent a couple of minutes on, we seem to have a lot of. But the question for all of you is, do we have the right kind of talent in the right set of numbers? Or is there some changes we need in that going forward? 1. Capital, many of us are in the venture capital sort of world. Of course, 10 years ago, there was not as much capital available as there is today. So today, I would say that maybe we've largely solved the capital problem. Of course, there can be that much more always, but that doesn't seem to necessarily be a binding constraint. 3rd is the technology piece. When I say technology, I actually mean, I think to all of your points about data and the software stack and the infra layer, is actual ownership of core IP, core technology that helps you build moats around your business, like Google has done with Android, Apple has done with OS, many other companies you can, cloud businesses you can talk about, many companies that have built core technology stacks that have allowed them to build moats around their businesses and continue to benefit greatly. Do we have enough of that? My sense is no, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the tech piece. Fourth is the policy piece, and I want you guys to get into that. Mr. Pai, you've touched upon that when we've been having discussion on data. The data localization piece is obviously one of the policy questions that our policymakers and we all are struggling with or grappling with, but there are other pieces. So I want to get your sense on where India stands on that policy adaptability, policy openness, and finally strategy. Right? What is India's strategy? What is our role going to be in this global tech ecosystem? One of the chapters I have in the book, for those who get the book, I'll encourage you to look at that for sure, is I've outlined a taxonomy of 7 strategies that different countries, in my view, around the world are adopting today. And this ranges from obviously this massive digital superpower, digital blitz strategy that the US and China have, which is we'll do everything. Whatever wave of tech comes, we are going to be winners in that. We're going to pour money. AI, sure. 5G, sure. Tomorrow, climate, sure. Right? I mean, not saying no to literally anything because they have the resources, the ability to. Then on the other end of the spectrum, there's digital entrepots, what I call digital entrepots, to draw this parallel between trading entrepots of the great trading game, which are countries like Singapore, Estonia, etc., which are lying at these hubs, right? Ireland. Now, on one end, you have these smaller nations, which have a very different strategy. You have the large US and Chinas of the world. Then I argue that Europe and India, for example, as regions at least, need to have a very different strategy. I believe that India, for example, and Europe also, in a way, if you look at them collectively as a region, are digital challengers today. We are not quite the US or China, but we are not digital laggards either. We have many of these 5 pieces that I've talked about, but we're not quite there yet. So the question is, how will digital challengers like India and Europe get possibly in a 30-year time frame or 20-year time frame to the level where the US and China are, right? So let me put this 5-piece framework to you and get your thoughts on this. Mr. Pai.
You're missing the big issue.
Which is?
I think you should stick to the big issue. What is the big issue? There are only 2 digital systems in the world. China with the firewall and Russia on one side, and the United States, Europe, and India.
That's right.
And the US controls the one part of the world. China is independent. Russia is seemingly independent. They have their own system.
Correct.
And China can shut out the entire world, still do well digitally because they got everything there, and they got a firewall. And they have data, they control surveillance. The United States does that for the whole world. It's a very benign power. Tomorrow, under the Defense Act of the United States, they can tell these big companies shut off their systems. Everybody is dead, gone. Apple will shut off all the iOS for the entire world, excluding the US. Microsoft shut off everybody. It'll cost them $2 billion of annual revenues, peanuts. It's all peanuts. I mean, let's understand the gravity of the situation. To me, that is the big issue. Yes, we are all democracies, we are all together.
So what would India...
No.
What
so what we need is a global compact where the United Nations has to come down and define how the new world order is going to be, where individual rights and countries' rights are clearly defined. So there's a global law to say you are doing something illegal under global law, which the democracies will hesitate to break. Even if they have to go to Iraq in that weapons of mass destruction, they got a fake UN resolution done, right? Otherwise, they don't want that burden, right? Whereas Russia doesn't care. Correct? Now, China has understood what it is. It has taken safety. It has a cyber army. It has a firewall. There's thousands of people working there. And they make sure inside they're safe, except for global trade. They have their own chips, even though depend on TSMC. Tomorrow, let's say TSMC is taken over in the digital chip world. What happens in the whole world? And in this world, the countries of Africa don't matter. They're irrelevant. I mean, South America is irrelevant. Southeast Asia is irrelevant except Taiwan. Taiwan controls the chips. India, not relevant. Irrelevant. $3.15 trillion. A small nation of no consequence in this can be easily controlled despite what we have done, and we got to do better. Europe, partly because of NATO, they're connected, so they will always work, so they will not do it. So this is the real issue, right, which in the grand game, in the great game, we have to define, and that's why we need a new institution. Now comes the second stage. What should India do as part of its defense? Right? Because then what policies India should have? One, India should have a cyber army. China will go after us. We need to have a cyber army, and we got to do what the US does. The CIA holds hacker conferences. Thousands of them come. They go talk to the best minds and say, come and join. And they're a loose army, and they can let them loose on anybody, any point of time they want, and have plausible deniability. India should do the same. We've been talking to people. Yes, sir, Delhi just doesn't understand, like you said. I hope they do it. They should have a cyber command, because we got those kind of people who can break into system. Pakistan comes and breaks in the system. They write something on that web page, the silly thing, and they, yeah. I mean, it's stupid. We can destroy the system if we call all of people to do. That's one. So we need cyber security, because our last system, like the power system, which was hacked in Bombay, they need to be protected. And the second thing we got to do is, how do you protect operating system? What he said, the platforms. We have to create our own platforms so we are safe. Or we need a law based on a global compact where they cannot deny service to us, where global platforms are there. Android. You shut off Android. Can you shut off Android? Maybe. There's a software we can shut off Android in this part of the world. So can we do that? Yes. Now you spoke about Airtel. Airtel, we control. It's here. I mean, we can do what we want because they are headquartered here. We can use the law. But we can't use the law against people who are outside. They will shut down their companies here and go away like they did in Russia. They just shut them down. So what do? So let's be clear about that. So we got to have our own platforms. UPI is fantastic because they shut off SWIFT. So Russia could not move money.
That's
so we
right.
got to use UPI to create a global system to do that. So we got to see where the connects are and do all that to protect us to the maximum extent so we not get blackmail into action. And the third thing is we have to invest in R&D. 6G, the next standard setting in R&D. 6G, the new standard. 5G is come, but there's a global standard. 6G. How do you sit at the table? How do you set the table in many new things? Our diplomacy has to expand. So R&D in a university, deep technology, we're not invested enough. Public funding is essential. And we are not done enough.
Right.
And we got to do the last thing. And the next thing, we got to be more activists globally as a mature democracy to create the global infrastructure which can protect us.
That's right.
There may never be a time when the US goes against us, but they used to blackmailing. They used to twisting your arm. Just now they gave a waiver for that S-400, right? Because they felt that we got to protect ourselves against China. They could say, we're going to sanction you. They did it to us. So can we trust the US? No. So we got to stand there to be a point where we can say, hey, you know what, you'll go after us, you're also going to be damaged somewhat. And we are lesser of an enemy, and almost 5% of the enemy that China is to the US. So I think these are big policy issues. We must think deeply, strategically, put the building blocks. Is it going to change in the next 10 years? No, maybe 10, 15 years, right? But we're going to be better than 80% of the world, I mean, in terms of number of countries and not population.
Irina.
Okay, I think the coming back to the 5 things that you kind of put across as how you can create a merger of those elements into the way you're kind of looking at the country. So first, in terms of the skill sets, with say more than 5 million people right now, and that going to about 10 million in the next few years for tech people. I think what is missing for us in a lot of times is that despite having 1 in 3 people being tech, is it the right level of tech intensity that we're having with every corporation? And I'm not talking tech graduates only, right? A banking organization, a manufacturer, everybody has got a tech developer audience. How do you make that happen? And you covered that apart in your thing as to how do you create that workforce, which is kind of relevant, and bringing that across to creating a foray. Because what happens then is that you bring in the concept of a citizen developer within every organization. You do not need to rely on a third party, or you do not need to rely on tech firms. You're creating people within your own organization who are kind of bringing across tech brains to solve a business problem. The other things that you talked about in terms of how do you kind of collaborate with the government towards a policy which is kind of for the greater good of the country, and ensure that that gets implemented in a manner which is inclusive and not disruptive. When I say that, say the data protection law, which is kind of coming across in a fray, how does that ensure that technology is taking strides ahead and still bringing across the rest of the things that will be taken through, right? So the India stack, which has got created and which is getting evolved in a very definitive manner, I really think that's a great way of saying as to how the nation is looking in a forward-looking direction, thinking about how India has its own way of developing and taking things, in which every element of whether you call it data sovereignty, whether you call it data residency, or any of these elements are taken into consideration. And the last part in terms of strategy, I do think that the way the industry is thinking about creating what you said about the ecosystem of not just the SaaS players, not just the startup players, but also say any GICs which are present here, they are trying to innovate. What can they do for the country? So bringing about a lot of innovation which can serve the nation, creating that ecosystem of platform players which will foster that spirit of bringing things which are for niche requirements of the country and then taking the stride forward.
Prashant?
Yeah, I think great points, both of them. I agree with most of what both of them are saying. I think on this one point of digitally now embedding technologies into our industries and ecosystem, I'm seeing a lot of good B2B platforms come up in our country, and that's great because it kind of helps these companies leapfrog and you know get their supply chains and demand chains you know better than even what some of our B2B platforms. We're starting to see that these platforms actually are a generation ahead of what many industries in the US are using, right? So there could be a great opportunity for us to, just like what happened in some of the other areas, because our industry is now leveraging these B2B platforms, which are built with a lot of today's, contemporary ideas. We have a great because these are not unlike consumer platforms, which are already monopolies and
That's
winner take alls in the US and in most places. The B2B platforms are slightly still kind of open. And what we are seeing is in many areas, let's say infrastructure, B2B platforms, when I talk infrastructure trading, right? Commodity trading platforms. A lot of these platforms, we were surprised to see that they've not evolved in the US. They're not mature in the US like what we thought they were. They would be for an economy that is this advanced. So there was, I think, the lot of the supply chains that feed into retail and consumer demand are very advanced, very refined, very nuanced. I mean, you just can't make that. I mean, what Walmart has created in terms of efficiency, you just can't, or what Amazon has created, right? But if you just take the chemical paint industry in the US, or some aspect of the manufacturing industry in the US, it's amazing how laggard they are when it comes to using platforms and technology and mobile just-in-time stuff, right? And having that power in the hands of every individual. So because we are mobile-centric, the platforms that we are evolving in B2B in some of these industries are a generation ahead. So there is a way in which we can, and we are already seeing them now go to the Near East. So we have our B2B companies now in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in some of these places. So I don't think it's too far from when we will embed some of these platforms, and that is great because these are, like I was saying, these are platform plays, and they always create moats and create value.
Yeah.
So that I just wanted to highlight this whole B2B thing that I'm seeing.
That's right.
And when it comes to strategy, I think we have a problem in being a country that likes big companies, scale companies to come up, but does not like to sell. I mean, when there is wealth created, that wealth is the same problem China had, right? China had that in a very extreme manner, that they couldn't swallow that kind of wealth creation. But I think we have the same problem. So we kind of start killing the golden goose, so to speak, right? So we have set ourselves on that path. And what that means in terms of strategy is that the key talent will go outside, and we will become a continuation of the outsourcing world, right? So we will not keep any of our platform IP in this country, because nobody wants to take the risk of not being able to monetize it because of our policies and how people in the dispensation view, people who kind of create wealth from those platforms. So Dubai will benefit, Singapore will benefit. Not everybody will go to the US, but I think we will lose a lot of good capabilities. And Mohan and all of us keep talking with Delhi that don't penalize folks for creating great industries here.
That's
right.
right.
The next generation industry. So policy and strategy is they're a bit confused on that side.
Yeah. No, I think I would largely agree. I think what Mr. Pai you've outlined is a tech Cold War scenario where India has to figure out where are we going to be if it's a battle between the US and China, and it is like a new Cold War, what people are calling the tech Cold War. Where does India stand? Because you're right that ultimately, I think your views are very realist. That tomorrow, countries that seem like friends, there are no permanent friends, right? Much like in politics, similarly in geopolitics. And I think, Prashant, to your point about the B2B piece, one of the key things that I have put in my book, at least as a way to spark the conversation about what role India will have, that is one of the key points, right? The B2C space, you're right, is monopolized. In fact, lends itself in the tech world to monopolistic business models. Whereas on the B2B side, it's still more fragmented, etc.
Yeah, it's both B2, enterprise B2B and industry
That's right.
B2B.
That's right. And the other piece I think that India could really capitalize on, even on the B2C side, might actually be in sectors that the US and China are not focused on, or at least the US is not focused on. If the tech Cold War plays out, as Mr. Pai was outlining, then maybe we just have to focus on the non-China part of the world. We have to figure out, are there sectors like agriculture, education, health, things like that. And UPI, of course, could be enabling some of these pieces, even fintech, where we could actually build some of the larger B2C companies in those sectors. So it's
climate tech where we're all starting at the same point.
correct. Or climate tech, which is the new wave, where we could potentially be one of the leaders. And I think that kind of challenger strategy, or that kind of startup strategy to a gorilla sitting in the room strategy is what India really needs, right? I'm going to open it up in a second to questions, but there's one question I want to get all of your thoughts on before I open it up for the Q&A, which is the R&D piece, Mr. Pai, that you mentioned. Right? I think some of you might be familiar that R&D spending in India is amongst the lowest in the world. We, I think, have a 0.6% of our GDP as our R&D spend. Countries like Korea, etc., are at 3.5%, 4%. China is at about 2.5%, 3%, etc. If R&D is the way to build tech that has moats, to build core tech IP that will stay, then clearly you have to do more R&D spending. You said the public spending needs to go up. Let me ask you one, why, and maybe just 30 seconds on this so we open up. 30 seconds on why we are not doing more public R&D spend. And second, what is going to be the role of the private sector? Because I'll tell you, in the conversations I had with public research institutions based out of Delhi and elsewhere, they said, listen, don't put this on us. Why isn't the private sector in India doing more R&D spend? So the question is twofold. Why are we not doing it if we are so clear that is a core element of winning in the great tech game? And second, how will it get done? Is it just public incentivizing the private, or a combination? Quickly, 30 seconds each on that question, then we'll open it.
Look at any nation which has done good R&D. Public spending is essential. India does not spend much. We only spend 6,000 crores in all our university system, which is a joke. It's not even 1/5 of what Harvard spends or whatever they spend. Okay, so public spending is required. What should public spending be? Public spending in the discovery of new knowledge, new technologies. On the application side, you can have private companies doing it, and they will do it when you give them capital. You have a particular policy base. Okay, I think that is very essential, and we must focus on areas where we are going to be. Then we must focus on standard setting. Today, the control is to standards. China is already got 6G standards. They're already sitting on it and driving the world. And if you look at all the standard setting, that's a major problem. Now, in the new education policy, government promised 50,000 crores, 10,000 crores a year. I don't know why they announced in parliament, they're not given money. And none of the newspapers are talking about it. They're talking so many silly things, not this very big critical thing, right? And the government has to do it. And then institutions like DRDO, which are all closed system, Indian Institute of Science, which is now opening up, and the CSIR, which is the other old historical big elephant, they have to open up to the private sector, to young people like NASA, which can be used. We went to NASA from IMA, And they told us very clearly, we live on public money. We will not do anything in competition with the private sector using public money. We will invest money in areas where the private sector is not there. Okay, so we got to think through this very carefully and make the citizens of this country partners, business partners. And I'll ask one last question. You see, we have a major problem with this labs in Delhi and others. Labs in Delhi that you talk to, and all this. But they say private sector doesn't come to us. Private sector asks them, what is it you got that we are going to come to you? Space, they got something. We need that. I think they opened up now, right? And DRDO has got something in high, missile technologies control system. They got to give that. See, it will only work if public spending benefits percolate to private sector and they don't use it to compete against the private sector. That is required. And this synergy is required. They got to start thinking. We need a much more open system, much more public funding, and private sector taken as partners.
Great.
Thank
Irina.
you. I think, yeah, just to continue on that, while public spending, I totally agree, has to be made much more conscious and it has to grow. I think even applauding the social entrepreneurs is a way of kind of bringing that culture across in a very inclusive way. One example which really inspired me, I don't know how many here have heard of Mandeshi Bank. And that's a microfinance bank for a cooperative bank by women for women, which was started because the last mile of women in rural India were not getting microfinance support for anything that they wanted to save. So they created this, went across to Reserve Bank of India, got the license. Now they have made it available on digital banking, set up the things across on cloud infrastructure. They now have 100,000 accounts and have given 50 billion as a loan, right? So these are staggering numbers. I think that's another way of kind of bringing it and making it more inclusive.
Prashant.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to get that kind of funding, what Mohan is talking about, for all our universities as a whole. But I think you can build centers of excellence, right? And I think we should pick 4 or 5 centers of excellence. And like ISRO is one. Mohan, that's what I mean, right? So you will have to pick 4 or 5 of those, and one could be for cybersecurity, one could be for drone and this other defense related areas. So we will have to, I think as a country, we don't have the capability to be broad-based research capable. I'm just being realistic again.
That's right.
And saying that we'll have to pick these 4 or 5 centers of excellence, and if you pump 10,000 crores into each of them, that's about maybe 50,000-60,000 crores. Then something meaningful can come up. And in addition to that, what Irina was saying is there is a lot of IP which the GICs and the other MNCs have, where they're willing to bring that IP and have that IP be worked on and developed further in this country. I don't think we are tapping into that.
That's right.
So new IP, because there is foundational IP on which you build other IP, right? If you don't have the foundational IP, how do you build new IP?
That's right.
So you can't. So can you collaborate with them and say new IP is going to be owned jointly by this whatever global organization and our Indian organization? So there's some creative ways in which. So I'm just saying, what are the shortcuts? What are the hacks?
That's right. Capital efficient ways
to
doing what others have. Obviously, they have access to a lot more capital.
We can't build it through our university system. I'm giving up that thing, right? That's very.
Let me give some data before you open up. I think data is important. We get 45 lakh crores as taxes for the center and the state. Government of India and state government spend 70 lakh crores a year. It's a lot of money. Why can't they put 1 lakh crore, 50,000 crore more into R&D across universities, institutions, and all that? It's a very small amount. Now, we went to the Chief Minister of Karnataka, he knows that, asked for 250 crore rupees this year, where the government is spending 2,75,000 crores in the budget. 250 crores, an accounting error, to say, let us have a research fund to give research on a contract basis to all universities and colleges in Karnataka to create a knowledge society. They just didn't understand. That's the problem with these people. They don't understand the future of this country lies in R&D and research. Put some money, not too much of money. Of course, some of the left will say, oh, one poor man didn't starve to death. Oh, this happens. We like the space. We are masters in space. Atomic energy, we've done it. Now, in this era, why don't you put some serious money, create an open system so we can do well? In 5 years, we can change everything.
That's right. That's right. No, I agree. I think that R&D has to be seen as a core element of winning in the great tech game, not as a potentially wasteful expenditure that will take away from the political subsidies that you need to do to win elections, right? I think that's the only way India will become a tech nation and not remain a talent nation, because that talent also, as you were rightly saying, Prashant, will run away at some point unless you become a core tech nation, right? So on that note, let me open it up to questions. You can raise your hand, tell us very briefly what you are, and brief questions. Okay, so maybe, is that the only mic we have? So maybe we can just line up there and maybe ask very brief questions, please. I know we are already running a bit past our own schedule, so.
So I just have one question for all of you, which is, there was a time where there were different governance structures that worked. I think nations as a governance structure, do you see that sort of surviving where you can't iterate as fast as technology iterates? And every iteration of technology puts higher risks on society. Nuclear energy is controlled by a very small select group. But if you look at CRISPR-Cas9 and things like that,
Yeah.
Those are things that anybody could do in a classroom, and that sort of has significant risks for all of humanity.
Absolutely. So the question is the model, is the idea of a nation as the primary governance unit, is that the right one? Is it under threat, etc.? I'll take two questions, then we'll tackle two at a time.
Thank you. So assuming we can't achieve total tech independence, and let's say the best we can get at is some sort of strategic interdependence with other nations, is the way to go about this more through the back doors, through the standard setting bodies like International Telecommunications Union and other bodies, ones that we have heard of? Or is it really in ways that are visible to public, like Group A in UAE, Singapore, France? Is it more Delhi-centric, or is it more people out on the front lines showing India on the global stage?
Do any of you want to tackle any of the, maybe we'll have one person tackle each. So we're not
Well, I'll
we're
answer
covering
this
more.
question. We got to be at the top of the pyramid. Standard setting, because standards are going to define the future. And we got to be part there so that whatever we are developing becomes part of that. In the meantime, do this Rupe, Gipe, all the nice thing we'll keep doing. But that's easier to do because the local market. But the standard setting will define the future. 7G is standards. We got to set up a group of people to work on 7G and contribute. Like China has got more patents in 6G than the United States. Why can't they put more money to get more patents in 7G if it comes than any other country? So we are at the table. We got to think ahead. What are the 10 big tech areas that are going to redefine the future? What is the standard that is being set? And how do you get inside and we set some of the standards and put patents to defend us against others?
And organizations like ITU, etc., that you've mentioned, I spent a fair bit of time in the book on them, because ITU, ICANN, all these tech standards bodies out there today have very little Indian presence. No contribution, but not even on the table in terms of secretariats, etc. Right? So one of the things I keep emphasizing even in my conversation in Delhi is that 70 years later, we're still crying about that UN seat, UN Security Council seat that we never took. That was presumably for our taking that time. Today, we could be sitting on the table in these tech standard bodies. We're not taking it. These tech standard bodies are dominated by Chinese over the last 10 years, the Europeans. Even the Americans have been a bit slow to wake up to this, but they're waking up. India is really far behind. So I do think that that's an important piece. Prashant, I think you want to add something.
No. I'm
Okay. The other question, the nation one, I'll quickly take an, unless Irina, you have
Yeah,
thoughts
I
on
think
that.
just a very brief point of view, depending on the issues which are there, right? Whether it's to do with something like a sustainability. India has its own sustainability goals. Now, does that kind of match up to any other industry which is kind of putting things which could further or make us go back, kind of a thing, right? So there should be a policy at a national level. Data protection, security. Are we kind of endangering by bringing in certain applications which are not adhering to that? So depending on certain themes, the nation always has a way of kind of putting, I would say, governance in terms of how it should be done.
Yeah. Sorry, to the question about the nation, right? The model of a nation. My view is on this, like, and I've mentioned this in the chapter where I talk about the tug of war between big tech firms and the state, who are obviously mounting one of the biggest challenges to the model idea of a nation state, right? In history, they're mounting a really big challenge, right? Both in terms of power influence, but also, as you're rightly saying, efficiency, fast iterations, moving on, and so on and so forth. See, the nation state is very powerful. It's very, very powerful. And it has so many tools at its disposal. I think to Mr. Pai's points earlier about how the US, if it wanted to leverage its tech companies and so on, could very easily leverage the powers of the state. I think that most nation states, especially the larger ones that are strong states, will not let big tech firms or any kind of corporate really trample upon the sovereign functions of the state. Sovereign functions being defense, currency, things like that. There they will really push back. But where they might let their hold maybe loosen a little bit is on functions that actually are better done by the private sector, right? And I think that'll be a good thing. But the nation state is, in my view, not going away because governments, etc., are just too powerful. They have too much at stake. Maybe we'll take the next couple of questions.
Questions we've been working on right in geopolitics. All of you have touched on this thing of what India is good at and what India should do. But fundamentally, what is it that the union government should recognize that India is good at, the comparative advantages of India, and how should it promote it for cooperation, for contesting international bodies? I recognize it as our manufacturing capability and our human capital, but based on all your experiences, what is the fundamental competitive advantages that India should, the government should recognize and really
And double down on. Sure. We'll take one more question and then.
Hi, my name is Sitara. So I run a company in the education and research space. So my first question would be to Pai, Mr. Pai sir. So we see that a lot of universities, of course, you spoke about funding, and I spent a lot of time trying to convince people in closed academic circles to open up and include the public more, and include more people in high quality training and research. So firstly, if you could release funding, one of the first things I've noticed is the absolute gap in exposure between something like a Tier 3 university and Tier 1. So firstly, how can we go about bridging that to include and mobilize more people like Sir said in creating better tech talent? And if you could put, so many $1 million in the top 5 universities to improve research, would you do that? Or if you had the same amount of money, would you spend it on the top 100 universities to improve the overall collective standard of training? So that would be my first question. And second question, ma'am, you spoke about how the level of training, or you have a lot of tech people, but they're not intense enough in the tech. So what gaps do you see, given that you're from the tech world? And what exactly are you looking at in terms of improving that skill gap?
Right. So 3 questions. One is, what are India's comparative advantages? Second is that we should double down on. Second is, do you take that $5 million spread? I think, Prashant, you've already answered that question. You said do centers of excellence where you concentrate on 5. And the third is on the talent skill
I'll
gap.
just add one thing to that, right? That I think you also need to, just like we spoke about ecosystems in other places, you can't have these people become centers of excellence overnight again just with talent from this country. I think we need to build, I think Singapore did that, right? So they created these clusters. They had talent kind of relocate in healthcare, and in many areas they were able to leapfrog and create research in a much faster momentum than what they were doing 10 years ago, right? So you need to, that's where I don't know if this is possible in many areas only with the institutions, public institutions, the way they are today. You need private, because you will not have this talent relocate and work in the environments that are there in our universities today. You can't change those universities in the next 10 years, right? So can you bring in private collaborations with those universities and have that combination then create a cluster for attracting global talent to create a better research ecosystem in these areas? So I think the model to leapfrog and accelerate this IP creation is something that at least I've been thinking how to, and there I think the GICs and MNCs have a very key role to play. Correct. Because they can attract, it's easier for a GE, whatever GE did in Bangalore, right? To some extent, you can do that in very specific areas. Yeah. And it's easy to get that talent because they come in, because they're comfortable to work in an ecosystem where they know GE understands or these companies understand, but our universities don't understand that.
That's right.
How to get this research translation done, right? And how to value these research folks. So it's going to be a little bit of a model building and paradigm building exercise that we need to do in terms of how to kickstart this.
That's the next book, Prashant.
Okay,
I think that's a
we'll
book.
welcome that.
Any other points to any of those two questions?
I
Three
want to
questions?
answer Pranay's view. I think where India has to contribute at the top in shaping the future of the world by new thought. There are global forums. We got to be there, like you said. And that's the way, because in the rest of it is difficult because we are not there. Second, to talk to a point, I would give up on India in this area in R&D. Because we can't change India. I've tried 30 years. It's worked, but I don't have life anymore in me. What I would do, I would create a Bangalore Innovation R&D cluster with 10 of the top research institutes, 10 of the universities, work with very bright startups and other people like you, and ask Prashant to give 250 crores a year, Chris 250 crores, government 500 crores, create 1,000 crore kitty, and incentivize them by giving them grants for research, provided they work with others and help create the ecosystem. That will change things in 5 years. Because give up on India, you can't change India. Go to Delhi and see. I mean, it's terrible. You can't get inside the door. The Darwan will not allow you if I go in a kurta. He has to go like this. It's very feudal. Second thing, what I will do is, I will make sure that in our city, we recognize the true heroes as these innovators and scientists, like our Science Foundation does, etc., so that we become the science city. Because look at Singapore, like you said, it's only 5 million people. It's a city state. Why can't we act like a city state intellectually and define what India does later? And concentrate our energy, concentrate everything here, work in a public-private partnership. I was talking to Umakant Soni of the Artificial Research Technology Park in ISC, and he had come and met me. I said, I want you 10x what you're doing today in 2 years. Create 1,500, 2,000 AI specialists in Bangalore through your work, working with ISC. Change the world, right? Do it here.
Can I put a thought, and I want to get quickly related to this.
Do it instead of coming and talking to the bow or big things. Ask him to put his money and start doing it.
Why, what if, like, and to your point about R&D money, you went to the government, they said no for 250 crores. We need to build these innovation clusters. The money is there in this country, right? I mean, there's no doubt, with the government as well as the private sector. So like we have this 2% CSR spend mandatory. Why shouldn't that actually become a 2% CSR / R&D spend? So the private sector now.
You're going to have a fight. Ask Premji to write a check of 1,000 crores, man. He's got a foundation of 2 lakh crores. He earns 8,000-9,000
why didn't
crores.
You guys go to the private sector, guys?
We are
Why
to
did
go.
you go to the
So, no,
government?
we are thinking. I mean, we are working on this research park plus university in some hybrid
That's
form, right? We are working on that, but it's just. I mean, I believe that it has to be many of us.
Correct.
And just
Not a
one,
few.
just not one.
Not a few.
Just this folks in Bangalore.
Yeah.
So we need 5 clusters, 6, 7 clusters, and while everything can happen in Bangalore, but I think it should be across.
Yeah. One point
I'll answer that
sorry,
question
go ahead.
on
Yes,
the
please.
one that you asked me about what's the kind of gap which exists and what can be done proactively. I think 2 things. First of all, it needs to, when you're grooming talent at any academic institution, it needs to be an outside in. Just the way when we are creating solutions for our customers, we need to not create the product and then look for a product market fit. It's like, what is the need of the industry, and then kind of bring that back in. That's pretty much a big bridge which needs to be brokered. And the second part is that it is changing at a very rapid pace.
That's right.
So there has to be a body which is continuously looking out annually in terms of refreshing it. Because if we are not doing this, we are kind of getting outdated, and then we're producing talent which needs to do that finishing school the minute they're kind of getting across into any corporate, and that's actually wastage of productive time.
Yeah. In the interest of time, why don't we take, can I just, are there 3 more questions? Okay, we're gonna, I think, just take these last 3 questions and then close it. And then, of course, we'll be around if more people want to chat later.
My name is Keith Brendan. I would like to know your thoughts on opening up UPI to the rest of the world. The reason I ask that is even though we talk about getting into open standards like 6G, that would be a long way for India to participate in those standards. But if we can use what we have and build
Correct.
consensus with the rest of the world, that will help our own engineers to understand how this is done. It will bring us into the fintech ecosystem.
Correct. And also build this kind of mutual interdependence that we've spoken about, which is important strategically.
Build consensus with the rest of the world and kind of use that as a starting point
Understood.
to get into the global stage.
Got it. Can we take the other two and then we'll address all three together?
So just had a quick thought and just wanted to get your views on it as well. So pandemic has taught us how to work from home, basically, and all these things, right? So my question is, or ideas that I want to get from you guys is, like, when you think of research, you think of a lab, you think of an institution, you think of a big dome, like MIT or something like that, right? What about research from home? Pictures from anywhere, research from your, dorm room, research
Sure.
from the basement. What can we do to create a research and development mindset?
So more decentralized research models.
Because I agree, we wait for nations and institutions and all of that. My daughter is here, probably she will have a daughter, and we'll still have.
That's right. Thank you.
That was a great discussion. Thank you so much. My name is Kanchan Newberry. I'm the founder of LoanGD. So I had a question around, in the tech game, as we're looking at India, where do we, also look at bringing in the human element, and can India take a lead in that? I think the human element in, the tech is a critical part because all of tech can alienate kind of, people. And create a lot of problems for the whole world. So can India also look at taking a lead, especially the human element part of it?
That's right.
And the second part of my observation was that, of course, all of you have mentioned what are the lacunas, and there's a metaverse which is out there, and why hasn't India taken a lead in the let's say it's just starting off, but definitely a lot more can be done because of there's a lot of shortcomings. India is not able to do it, so we could understand a lot of it, which was brought out very well by Paisa. My observation was around, we do have these infrastructures which have been put up by the government. Like if you're looking at the centers of excellence, which are the STPIs, which are all across the country. But I see they're just there. There's not a lot of interaction with the rest of the
Sure.
I just wanted your views on what can make these centers of excellence, which have already been set up by the government, how can they interact really well with the rest of the ecosystem,
Correct.
and what is not being done?
Sure. So UPI, India taking lead on the human element in tech, and sorry, I in fact forgot the third question.
More decentralized research.
More decentralized research models. Right? So any of you want to tackle?
If you all want to go.
No, go ahead,
Okay.
Irina.
So this is to the last question, the two questions that you asked. One is in terms of the human-centric approach to technology. I would just say that India is an opportunity, and a very big one, because the last mile opportunity that we have to impact the rural ecosystem is with that human element. Because whatever is happening there, frankly, a lot of corporates, private, public, etc., they're kind of creating local models and scaling it globally. Talk about Gates Foundation and a lot of other foundations. They are actually creating their first of their prototypes here using technology and scaling it across to the world. It might not be the way you articulated the question, but it is technology for solving human problems, which are then taken across globally. The second part that you asked about, say, experiences of metaverse, of course, that's a new thing out here. But let me also tell you that closer home, various industries, whether we were talking to a jewelry founder, and the way in the pandemic period, they actually took the mixed reality and the augmented reality, Senko Gold and Diamonds, and how they kind of made it experiential for reaching their last mile consumers, and how they made it inclusive for their karigars to give their design sitting at their homes and taking it across. These are actually taking it to the last mile. Of course, there's a lot of strides to cover, but it's happening as well.
And I think that gives you a clue on the kind of values that I think India could champion, right? UPI is if you look at the values underlying UPI, it's inclusiveness, it's interoperability, openness, right? I think that's the set of values that India can champion, should champion in global governance, global human rights frameworks, etc. I think that's one. Second, I think that sustainability, right? I mean, if you look at India's economy in general, that is not industrialized, that is not tech driven today, very sustainable. Our rural economy, for example, is inherently very sustainable, very circular. And I think that's again a set of values that India can export and should export, right? Through our companies, through our business models. But I think that inherent sustainability that you actually see in India still, that other countries are now trying to figure out how to make that happen for the first time. I think there are a lot of interesting, sustainable, circular models already in India that actually India should be seeking to scale up and benefit from them, right? From a realist wealth creation standpoint, also benefit from, I think. Any
No, I'll
other?
just, I think there was a question on UPI, taking it up. I think, see, countries have been a bit wary about directly working with the government,
That's
right?
right.
Because, nobody wants to say, okay, we took this technology from this,
That's
this
right.
government. So MOSIP, which MOSIP,
SIP. correct.
MOSIP now has tied up with 7 countries. 7 countries, they have about 70 million consumers onboarded, right? And they're starting with identity, of course. These are African nations. But the interesting thing is they're using this channel approach where they're going to these African countries through France, right? They're going to the GCC through Dubai, right? The UAE, right? And I think their goal is to get to 1 billion people, right, on their platform in the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
Which is not bad, right? I mean, you just think of it, right? I don't know if Visa, Mastercard, any of these guys would have 1 billion people on their platform today.
That's right.
So I think that MOSIP is a great initiative, and I think we
Yeah,
should support that.
I had a discussion with one of the think tanks based out of Bombay, Artha Global, on this specifically, right? On exporting UPI, what are the right models? Because you're right, the moment you're doing it government to government, there are a lot of strategic concerns, other concerns, blah blah. The MOSIP model you've mentioned, I think, is a very interesting one. The way I have been thinking about it, again, it's not a fully evolved thought yet, is really, if you think about how Apple and Android have, Apple and Google have done it, is they haven't necessarily gone out and said, hey, listen, I want to export Android or I want to export iOS. Actually, what they've done is they've made it really easy for people, no matter where they're in the world, to build apps on it. And I think that's the kind of approach we should have with UPI. I understand these are protocols right now, but ultimately they've got to become almost like an operating system, what I call the digital OS for the world, where actually what we should be exporting is not the OS. We should be saying we're going to make it so easy for, let's say, an African country to now build equivalent of a Razor Pay there. That is going to leverage the infrastructure that we've built, the standards we have built. And then we shape those standards, we shape the platforms, we benefit economically from that standards. But the apps are built sort of in a more decentralized global manner. I think that's an interesting way to think about exporting UPI also. I think any other closing thoughts? Perfect. Now, let me first thank all of you. I think it was an absolute delight. And thank you to all of you.
Are we better than Bombay and Delhi?
I have to say, as I mentioned in the beginning of my remarks, these conversations that I've been having in Delhi and Bombay come from a policy standpoint. Here, the conversation has clearly been from a tech first, innovation first standpoint. I think that's the key difference. And one of the goals, I mean, as I mentioned, the book was one of the reasons I wanted to write a book that spans these topics is that these conversations need to happen more between all of us. Because ultimately, if the policy piece doesn't get fixed, then unfortunately the tech and innovation piece will not work, and vice versa.
I have one crib on the book.
Please.
Very little on Bangalore.
Is it? Though most of the book is actually driven from all the things that are happening in Bangalore.
I think somewhere Delhi seems to have a little bit more.
I've been influenced.
Yeah.
I've been influenced. But no, thank you so much to all of you, and thank you to all of you for coming and taking time on a Friday evening. I hope you guys get a copy of the book. And please share your thoughts, feedback with me also. And I hope we can keep this conversation going. Thank you so much.
Thank you.